When 18-year-old Elisabeth vanished, her family was shocked to receive a letter claiming she'd joined a cult. Years passed without a word, until one day, a malnourished child appeared on their doorstep with a note saying it was their grandchild. Then another child arrived, and then a third. As the children grew, they bore an eerie resemblance to their grandfather. What happened to Elisabeth, and why would her children show up under such strange circumstances? The answers lie closer than anyone could imagine. Welcome back to the Midnight Docket, where we uncover some of the most disturbing and vile cases from around the world. Tonight, we leave Sweden and travel to the small Austrian town of Amstetten, where a dark secret remained hidden for nearly a quarter of a century until it finally was uncovered in 2008. Get comfortable, if you can, because this is a story that will stay with you long after it's told. Let's begin. Amstetten is a small town located in Lower Austria, about 75 miles west of Vienna. With a population of around 23,000, Amstetten is a quiet community often described as unremarkable, a place where life moves at a slower pace, and the troubles of the outside world feel far removed. Austria itself is a land of contrasts. Famous for its breathtaking alpine landscapes, historic architecture, and cultural treasures, the country also carries the darker legacy of its role in World War II and its ties to Adolf Hitler.
Since the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, there have been only a few really momentous days in the history of Europe. Mussolini marching on Rome, Stalin launching his first five-year plan, Hitler breaking the bonds of Versailles one by one. Today comes another such mighty moment, as Hitler's bond bursting finally carries Nazi expansion across the borders of Germany into the land of his birth. As officials pull down the frontier barriers, the political significance of these pictures is still too fresh in the minds of the world to need discussion. So without comment, we present the story of Germany's march into Austria, across the bridge over the river Salza into Salzburg.
By 2008, Austria had long since rebuilt its image, emerging as a modern and peaceful nation. Yet, beneath this polished surface, unimaginable horrors were taking place in the heart of Amstetten. The Fritzl family appeared to be a typical Austrian household. Josef Fritzl, known to his neighbors as polite and respectable, was a well-known figure in the town of Amstetten. Born on April 9, 1935, to Josef Sr. and Maria Fritzl, his early life was anything but idyllic. From the outset, Josef's childhood was marked by instability, trauma, and a profound sense of rejection. Josef was an only child, raised primarily by his mother after his father, a severe alcoholic, abandoned the family when Josef was just 4 years old. This early act of abandonment left an indelible mark on the boy, who grew up without the stability or affection of a father figure. Josef Sr.'s departure was not a quiet one. The elder Fritzl left behind a trail of destruction and debts, leaving Maria to pick up the pieces of a broken household. Maria, described by those who knew her as strict and domineering, took on the role of both provider and disciplinarian. She worked tirelessly to make ends meet, but her stern demeanor and high expectations cast a shadow over Josef's formative years. Witness accounts from neighbors and acquaintances suggest that Maria's parenting style bordered on harshness, often leaving Josef feeling inadequate and isolated. In her eyes, he was a boy who needed to grow up quickly, and she showed little patience for weakness or failure. During World War II, Josef's life took another turn when his absent father was drafted into the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces. Josef Sr. never returned from the war. He was killed in combat in 1944, when Josef Jr. was just 9 years old. His name was later inscribed on a war memorial in Amstetten, though it's unclear if Josef ever visited or felt any connection to the father, who had long since abandoned him. Despite these challenges, Josef showed signs of intelligence and ambition early on. He excelled in his studies, particularly in technical subjects, and later attended a technical college, where he earned a qualification in electrical engineering. By all appearances, Josef seemed determined to rise above the hardships of his childhood and carve out a successful future for himself. But beneath the surface, the seeds of resentment and a need for control had already begun to take root. In 1956, at the age of 21, Josef married a woman named Rosemarie, who was just 17 years old at the time. Together, they had 7 children, 4 daughters and 3 sons, with Elisabeth being their 4th child, born on April 6, 1966. Rosemarie was a homemaker, tending to the household and raising the children, while Josef worked and managed the family's finances. The Fritzl home was located in a quiet residential neighborhood of Amstetten, and outwardly the family seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors, Josef's controlling and abusive behavior dominated the household. He demanded strict obedience from his children and was described as a tyrannical patriarch. His wife, Rosemarie, appeared to accept his behavior, whether out of fear, denial, or a desire to keep the family together. Elisabeth, like her siblings, was raised in this oppressive environment. Despite the dysfunction, she was described as a quiet and polite child who had dreams of her own, even though her father's actions began to crush her spirit early on. While the family's neighbors saw them as relatively normal, Josef's authoritarian control ensured that his darker side remained hidden. In the late 1970s, Josef Fritzl began an ambitious project beneath his family's home. What started as a simple basement renovation quickly evolved into something far more elaborate and mysterious. He told his family and neighbors that he wanted to expand the storage space and utility areas. But in truth, Josef had a very different plan, one that no one could have imagined. By the early 1980s, the Fritzl family's life seemed stable. The older children were beginning to carve out their own paths, with Elisabeth showing a particular interest in becoming independent. At the time, the Fritzl household seemed like any other in the quiet Austrian town. Josef worked hard as a technical equipment salesman, traveling frequently across the country, while his wife Rosemarie took care of their 7 children. Their home was busy and full of energy, with children running around and neighbors occasionally stopping by for a friendly chat. Josef maintained his image as a strict but responsible provider, respected for his success as a landlord and businessman. But Josef was also a man of intense privacy. He rarely allowed anyone, even his family, to enter the basement. "That's my space," he would shout. To the outside world, this behavior might have seemed eccentric, but not unusual. After all, Josef was known to be a hands-on property owner, often working late into the night on projects around the house or for his rental properties. By 1981, the renovations were well underway. Josef's basement began to take shape as a labyrinth of interconnected rooms and corridors. He built walls of reinforced concrete, installed thick steel doors, and even wired the space with its own electrical system. He worked methodically, often spending hours underground while the rest of the family went about their daily lives upstairs. The Fritzl family paid little attention to what Josef was doing in the basement. He had always been the decision-maker in the household, and questioning his authority was not something anyone dared to do. Rosemarie, accustomed to Josef's strict demeanor, assumed his basement project was just another one of his hobbies or business ventures. To the children, the basement was a source of curiosity. They occasionally heard noises from below, hammering, drilling, and other sounds of construction. But Josef never allowed them to explore the space. "This is not a place for kids," he would bark if they tried to sneak a peek. Over time, they learned to leave it alone. Meanwhile, life in the Fritzl household carried on. The children went to school, Rosemarie handled the household chores, and Josef balanced his work and his property management. The family celebrated holidays together, took occasional trips, and maintained a relatively quiet existence in the small town of Amstetten. To their neighbors, they were an ordinary family with a hard-working father at the helm. But beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, Josef was harboring a dark secret. As he carefully expanded the basement, installing ventilation systems and creating hidden compartments, No one questioned why such extensive work was necessary for a simple storage area. The project stretched on for years, and Josef's determination never wavered. Looking back, some neighbors would later recall small, peculiar details. One neighbor mentioned hearing strange noises from the basement during the night, but Josef always had a plausible explanation. Faulty pipes, he said, or the heating system acting up. Others noted his occasional secrecy, or his insistence on doing all the work himself, but Josef's polite demeanor and reputation as a hard-working man kept suspicion at bay. Little did the world, or even his wife and children, know what was about to unfold. By 1984, the basement was nearly complete, though its true purpose remained a mystery to everyone but Josef. The Fritzl family continued to live their lives, unaware that the space beneath their feet would soon become the setting for one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Josef, however, knew exactly what he had created. For years, he had harbored a sinister plan, and now, with the final modifications in place, the basement was ready. While the rest of the world went about their lives blissfully unaware, Josef Fritzl was preparing to change the lives of his family forever. On August 28, 1984, life in the Fritzl household seemed ordinary. Elisabeth, 18 years old at the time, had recently completed a course to become a waitress and was looking forward to starting her life as an independent adult. However, unbeknownst to her, her father, Josef Fritzl, had been meticulously planning something that would rob her of that freedom and change her life forever. That day, Josef called Elisabeth aside. He asked her to help him with a project in the basement. The basement had always been his domain, a place where he spent countless hours working on renovations and business-related tasks. Elisabeth, eager to be helpful, and perhaps seeking her father's approval, agreed without hesitation. Josef explained that he needed help installing a heavy door. He had her hold the door steady as he positioned it into the frame. The atmosphere in the dimly lit basement was quiet, with only the sound of Josef's tools echoing off the concrete walls. Elisabeth had no reason to suspect anything sinister. For all her life, Josef had been a controlling and overbearing figure, but she couldn't have imagined the depths of his depravity. Once the door was secured, Josef made his move. Without warning, he pulled out an ether-soaked cloth and pressed it over Elisabeth's face. She struggled, but the chemical's effects were swift. Within moments, she lost consciousness. When Elisabeth woke up, she found herself in a small, cramped room. The heavy door, which she had unknowingly helped install, was now locked shut behind her. The realization of what had happened began to set in as she looked around the dimly lit space. The walls were cold and bare, and the air was stale. She was trapped. Josef soon appeared, his demeanor calm and collected, as though nothing unusual had happened. He told Elisabeth that this was her new home and that she would never leave. His words were cold and final, extinguishing any hope of escape. Over the coming days, he brought down basic supplies, food, water, and bedding, and set the tone for what would become a long nightmare. At first, Elisabeth pleaded with her father to let her go. She cried, begged, and screamed, hoping that someone upstairs, her mother or siblings, would hear her. But the basement was soundproof, and Josef's careful planning ensured that her cries would never reach the outside world. He warned her that resistance was futile. He made it clear that no one would come looking for her. Josef offered no answers in regards to why he had her locked up. Instead, his actions spoke louder than words. That day, he raped his daughter for the first time, a violation that would become a daily ritual. From the very first moment, Josef asserted total dominance over Elisabeth. He made it clear through his actions and words that no one would save her, that she was utterly alone. The small windowless room became her entire world, one dominated by Josef's presence. His power over her was absolute, and she had no choice but to endure. Josef would descend into the basement multiple times a day, bringing food, water, and supplies. But his visits were never just for maintenance. Each time, Elisabeth braced herself for the inevitable. The terrifying moments, when he would use her as a tool to satisfy his depraved desires. There was no escaping his grasp. The basement was soundproof, fortified with layers of reinforced concrete and locked behind multiple doors. The abuse wasn't just physical. Josef's calculated cruelty extended to psychological torment as well. He reminded Elisabeth daily that she had no hope of freedom. He told her that the outside world had forgotten about her, that no one was looking for her, and that her mother and siblings had moved on with their lives. These lies were designed to break her spirit and ensure her compliance. Over time, the routine became a horrifying normalcy. Josef's visits were unpredictable. Sometimes he would come in the morning, sometimes late at night. Elisabeth was always on edge, never knowing when he would enter the room or what mood he would be in. She was entirely at his mercy, a prisoner in every sense of the word. The assaults were not just an expression of Josef's deviance. They were also a means of control. By reducing Elisabeth to a victim, by stripping her of her autonomy, he cemented his dominance. His frequent abuse ensured that she remained fearful, docile, and compliant. He used every opportunity to remind her that her life belonged to him. There was no reasoning with him, no appealing to his humanity, because he seemed to have none. For Josef, this was not just about power, it was about ownership. In his twisted mind, Elisabeth was no longer his daughter. She was his possession. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Elisabeth remained locked in the windowless room, completely cut off from the outside world. She had no idea that the space Josef had lured her into was part of a larger, hidden prison he had spent years constructing beneath their home. Above ground, life in the Fritzl household carried on as usual. Rosemary believed her daughter had truly run away, while Josef continued to project the image of a hard-working and respectable family man. But beneath the surface, Josef's monstrous plan was in motion, and Elisabeth's unimaginable ordeal had only just begun. Now you might be asking yourself, what about the law enforcement and the rest of the family and friends? Did they not search for her, investigate her disappearance? Well, Josef had made sure that the search efforts would be minimal. Before her captivity began, Elisabeth had made several attempts to escape the oppressive control of her father. Threatening to run away had become her only way of expressing rebellion in a household where Josef ruled with an iron fist. On more than one occasion, Elisabeth made good on those threats. Once, she traveled as far as Vienna with a friend, seeking freedom in the bustling streets of the Austrian capital. But each time, her father managed to drag her back home, whether by police intervention or his own relentless pursuit. Josef was determined to keep her under his thumb, and Elisabeth learned the hard way that escaping his reach was nearly impossible. So, when Elisabeth vanished without a trace on August 28, 1984, no one questioned Josef's explanation. He told his wife Rosemary, their children, and even the police that Elisabeth had run away again, this time to join a religious sect. It wasn't an outlandish claim. Many young people at the time were becoming involved in fringe groups, and Josef was convincing in his performance as a worried yet resigned father. To further break Elisabeth's spirit and at the same time add credibility to his claim that she had run away, Josef forced her to write a letter, claiming that she had joined a cult. He told her that this letter would explain her sudden disappearance to her mother, Rosemary, and the police. She had no choice but to comply, knowing her father held all the power. The letter was postmarked from a nearby town, Braunau, and delivered to the police. It stated that Elisabeth was safe, had left of her own free will, and warned her family not to try to find her. Josef's cunning deception worked. The investigation into her disappearance was closed, and Elisabeth's captivity became his well-guarded secret. And Elisabeth's friends and family, unaware of Josef's monstrous secret, believed him without question. But Elisabeth had not joined a sect. She was closer than anyone could imagine, hidden in a prison beneath the family's garden. Above her head, life continued as normal. The Fritzl family held barbecues in the yard during the summer. the laughter of children and clinking of glasses echoing in stark contrast to the silence of Elisabeth's underground chamber. The very soil beneath their feet concealed Josef's dark secret, and no one suspected a thing. Meanwhile, as the result of the ongoing sexual assaults, Elisabeth became pregnant in 1986, just 2 years into her imprisonment. She was terrified, not just of the physical ordeal, but of what it would mean to bring a child into the basement. With no access to medical care, she had to face the pregnancy alone. But her body, weakened by malnutrition and stress, could not sustain it. Elisabeth miscarried in the 10th week. The pain of losing the baby was compounded by the suffocating reality that there was no solace in the darkness, no one to comfort her or acknowledge her grief. Instead, the nightmare continued, and in 1988, Elisabeth gave birth to her first surviving child, a daughter she named Kerstin. Without any medical help, Elisabeth delivered her baby entirely on her own. Josef provided minimal supplies, and Elisabeth had to improvise with what little she had. Despite the horrific circumstances, Kerstin became a light in Elisabeth's otherwise bleak world. 2 years later, Elisabeth gave birth to her second child, Stefan. Like his sister, Stefan was born in the basement. Elisabeth now had 2 children to care for in their dark prison. She taught them to speak, to read, and to hope, even though her own hope was dwindling. She worked tirelessly to create some semblance of normalcy for them, despite the constant threat of Josef's unpredictable visits. When Elisabeth gave birth to her third child, Lisa, in 1992, Josef made a decision that shocked her. When Lisa was just a baby, Josef took her upstairs, telling Elisabeth that the family would raise her as their own. Elisabeth had no choice but to comply. To the outside world, Josef spun another elaborate lie, claiming Lisa had been abandoned on their doorstep with a note from Elisabeth, who was supposedly still living with the mysterious cult. The deception worked, and Lisa became part of the Fritzl household upstairs, completely unaware of her mother's suffering below. In 1994, Elisabeth gave birth to their fourth child, Monica. Josef repeated his staged abandonment, leaving Monica in a stroller outside the Fritzl home. Rosemarie, Josef's wife, raised Monica as her own, believing Josef's story that Elisabeth had left the child for them to care for. While Elisabeth grieved the loss of yet another child to the world above, she found solace in the fact that Lisa and Monica would have a life beyond the basement's walls. As the Josef's family, or families, continued to grow, the space for his imprisoned family shrinked as Kerstin and Stefan became older and required more room. This presented Josef with a new problem. What should he do? He can't simply let the 2 oldest children out. That would mean the end of his sick world he had created for himself. Well, he solved the problem the same way as he had done before. Josef Fritzl began expanding the basement to accommodate the growing downstairs family in 1993. By this time, the living conditions in the original cellar, approximately 35 square meters, about 380 square feet, had become increasingly cramped as more children were born in captivity. Josef allowed Elisabeth and her children to help dig out additional space using their bare hands and basic tools. Over the course of several years, the basement was enlarged to 55 square meters, about 590 square feet. The expansion included more sleeping areas, a rudimentary cooking space, and additional facilities like a toilet and wash basin. This work was carried out under Josef's strict supervision, reinforcing his control over Elisabeth and her children while keeping them physically and mentally occupied. This, in turn, created another problem for Josef of a logistical nature. What to do with the immense amount of earth that had to be excavated? To cover his tracks, Josef took on another project above ground. He constructed a swimming pool in the backyard, using the pool as a convenient excuse for why so much dirt was being hauled away. Neighbors thought nothing of it, admiring Josef's ability to upgrade the family home and provide such luxuries. As the pool was filled with water and the family splashed and laughed above, Elisabeth remained trapped below. The sound of her siblings enjoying the pool, the one built to cover up the labor that expanded her prison, was a cruel reminder of her isolation. She could hear their voices faintly through the layers of concrete and earth, but they would never hear her cries for help. To Josef, the pool was more than a cover-up. It was a symbol of his ability to maintain his double life. As time went by, Elisabeth gave birth to twin boys in 1996, Michael and Alexander. But the joy of their arrival was short-lived. Michael was born with breathing complications, and without proper medical care, he died just 3 days later. Josef showed no remorse. He took Michael's tiny body, incinerating it in the furnace to destroy the evidence. For Elisabeth, it was an unimaginable loss, which was amplified when Josef took Alexander upstairs to be raised in the household, once again repeating the same lie he had used for Lisa and Monica. 7 more years passed before, in 2002, Elisabeth gave birth to her youngest child, Felix. Josef decided to leave Felix in the basement, joining Elisabeth, Kerstin, and Stefan. By this point, the basement had expanded slightly, with Josef allowing Elisabeth and her children to dig out more space over the years. Despite her circumstances, Elisabeth remained resilient. She took on the role of teacher, caretaker, and protector, doing her best to shield her children from the truth of their captivity. She taught them to read and write using old books and scraps Josef occasionally brought down. She created stories, sang songs, and found ways to make the darkness a little less frightening. But the emotional toll was devastating. Elisabeth worried constantly about the children Josef had taken upstairs, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, wondering if they were safe, loved, and happy. Meanwhile, she tried to keep the 3 children with her in the basement from succumbing to despair. The duality of their lives, the carefree family above and the imprisoned daughter below, was a chilling testament to Josef's cunning and depravity. For Elisabeth, every day in captivity was a reminder of how close she was to freedom, and yet completely unreachable to those living just meters above her. It was a life hidden in plain sight, with Josef holding all the keys, both literal and metaphorical, to her survival. Fast forwarding to April 19, 2008, the day began like any other in the Fritzl household. Josef Fritzl, now 73 years old, continued his double life, upstairs as a respected, if stern, family man, and downstairs as the captor of his daughter Elisabeth and their 3 remaining children in the basement. But that day, a single event would set off a chain reaction that would change everything. By then, the oldest of Elisabeth's children in captivity, Kerstin, was 19 years old. Having lived her entire life underground, her health had deteriorated due to the lack of fresh air, sunlight, and medical care. In mid-April, Kerstin became gravely ill. She began having severe seizures, and Elisabeth, desperate to save her daughter's life, pleaded with Josef to take her to the hospital. For days, Josef refused, but as Kerstin's condition worsened, he realized that her death might draw attention he couldn't afford. On April 19th, Josef finally relented. He carried the unconscious Kerstin out of the basement, her first time seeing the outside world, and brought her to the local hospital, Landesklinikum Amstetten Mauer. Josef spun another lie, telling the doctors that Kerstin had been left on his doorstep with a note from her mother, Elisabeth, who was living in a cult. The doctors, however, were immediately suspicious. Kerstin's condition was life-threatening, and her malnourished, pale appearance indicated a lifetime of neglect. The hospital staff contacted the police, who began investigating Josef's claims. They appealed to the public for Elisabeth, the supposed mother of Kerstin, to come forward. Meanwhile, Elisabeth, still in the basement, begged Josef to let her visit Kerstin in the hospital. She feared for her daughter's life, and saw this as her only chance to escape. After several days of persuasion, Josef agreed, likely under the belief that Elisabeth, broken after decades of captivity, would never betray him. On April 26, 2008, Josef brought Elisabeth and her 2 sons, Stefan and Felix, out of the basement. It was their first time stepping outside in decades, or, in the case of the boys, in their entire lives. Josef told his wife, Rosemary, that Elisabeth had returned home after years in the sect. Then, he drove Elisabeth and her sons to the hospital to see Kerstin. When Josef Fritzl walked into the hospital, bringing Elisabeth and her 2 sons with him, the staff immediately felt something was off. His story, that Elisabeth had returned after years in a mysterious cult, was strange enough on its own, but it didn't quite explain Kerstin's dire condition. The 19-year-old was still in a coma, fighting for her life, and her malnourished, fragile appearance raised questions the doctors couldn't ignore. Elisabeth's presence only deepened the mystery. The woman looked pale and gaunt, her demeanor timid and wary. Josef claimed she was Kerstin's mother, but the details he gave about her supposed life with a cult were vague and contradictory. The hospital staff, already uneasy about Josef's explanations, quietly flagged the situation to the authorities. It wasn't Elisabeth's appearance alone that aroused suspicion. It was the glaring inconsistencies in Josef's story. Why, they wondered, would a mother stay silent for years while her daughter's health deteriorated so severely? Why had Josef waited until it was almost too late to seek medical help for Kerstin? The more questions the staff asked, the less sense Josef's answers made. It wasn't long before the police were called to investigate, setting into motion the unraveling of Josef's dark secrets. Officers arrived to question her, but Elisabeth, terrified of Josef's threats, initially refused to say anything. Josef had spent years instilling fear in her, telling her that if she ever tried to escape, she and her children would be killed, or the basement would be filled with gas. It was only after the police promised Elisabeth that she would never have to see her father again that she broke down and revealed the horrifying truth. Over 2 hours, Elisabeth recounted her 24 years of captivity, the repeated rapes, the 7 pregnancies, and the unimaginable conditions in which she and her children had lived. The police acted swiftly. Josef Fritzl was arrested that same night, right there at the hospital. He initially denied everything, but confronted with Elisabeth's testimony and DNA evidence, which confirmed he was the biological father of her children, Josef confessed to his crimes. On April 27, 2008, police searched the Fritzl home and discovered the hidden basement. They found a maze of rooms connected by narrow passageways, secured by multiple locked doors, including a heavy, concrete-reinforced door with an electronic code. Inside, investigators uncovered the living quarters where Elisabeth and her children had spent their lives. Makeshift beds, a rudimentary kitchen, and the sparse furnishings of a world cut off from light and hope. The details of the discovery shocked even the most seasoned officers. The conditions were damp, cramped, and dark, and the smell of mold and decay lingered in the air. The basement revealed the lengths Josef had gone to hide his crimes, but it also stood as a testament to Elisabeth's resilience, how she had managed to create a life for her children under such horrific circumstances. As news of the Fritzl case broke, it sent shockwaves around the globe. The horrifying details of Elisabeth's 24 years of captivity, the abuse she endured, and the existence of a secret family living beneath the Fritzl home were almost too horrific to comprehend. Questions arose about how Josef had managed to conceal such atrocities for so long, and how no one, his wife, his neighbors, or the authorities, had suspected anything. For Elisabeth and her children, this was the beginning of the end of a long nightmare. They were immediately taken into protective care, shielded from the media, and given extensive medical and psychological treatment. Doctors worked to stabilize Kerstin, who eventually recovered, and helped the entire family begin the slow process of healing. Josef Fritzl was charged with an array of crimes, including murder by negligence, for the death of the infant Michael, rape, incest, enslavement, false imprisonment, and coercion. In March 2009, he pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to life imprisonment in a facility for the criminally insane. Josef Fritzl's darker tendencies became apparent long before Elisabeth's captivity. In 1967, he broke into the Linz home of a 24-year-old nurse and raped her at knife point, threatening to kill her if she screamed. He was arrested and sentenced to 18 months in prison, though he served only 12. This incident, along with allegations of indecent exposure and attempted rape, revealed a pattern of predatory behavior. However, due to Austrian law at the time, his criminal record was expunged after 15 years, erasing any evidence of his past crimes. This omission would later enable Josef to foster and adopt children born from his abuse of Elisabeth without raising suspicion. Beyond his confirmed crimes, Josef Fritzl has been linked to several unsolved murders, though he was never formally charged. In 1986, 17-year-old Martina Claudia Posch disappeared in Vöcklerbruck, Upper Austria, and her body was later found strangled near Lake Mondsee, close to the campground Josef and his wife managed. Authorities noted the physical resemblance between Posch and Elisabeth, raising suspicions about Josef's involvement. Fritzl was also investigated for the murder of 17-year-old Anna Neumeier in 1966 and the 2007 murder of 42-year-old Gabriela Supekova, a prostitute whose body was found near the Austrian-Czech border while Fritzl was on holiday in the area. Despite the circumstantial evidence, no charges were filed due to a lack of concrete proof. I know you still have one big question, and I hear you. What about Rosemary? How could she not have known about the horrors unfolding in her own home for over 2 decades? This very question has led many to wonder whether Rosemary was complicit, willfully ignorant, or a victim of Josef's manipulation and control herself. Rosemary was described by those who knew her as a devoted wife and mother, someone who took care of the household and her children, while Josef worked long hours and often disappeared into the basement. It was common knowledge that Josef was a controlling and authoritarian figure in their marriage, and many believe Rosemary was so accustomed to his dominance that she avoided questioning his actions. This may have included his secretive behavior surrounding the basement, which he kept strictly off limits to everyone, including her. Josef's lies about Elisabeth's disappearance played a significant role in maintaining his double life. When Elisabeth vanished in 1984, Josef claimed that she had run away to join a religious cult, even presenting a letter he had forced her to write. Rosemary reportedly accepted this explanation, though it's unclear whether she truly believed it or chose to believe it to avoid confronting a more unsettling truth. Compounding the mystery is the fact that 3 of Elisabeth's children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were raised upstairs by Josef and Rosemary. Josef staged their discovery with elaborate lies, claiming that Elisabeth had left them on the family's doorstep, with notes asking her parents to care for them. Rosemary not only accepted these children into the household, but also helped raise them, apparently never questioning the increasingly bizarre circumstances of their appearance. Social workers who visited the home described her as a warm and loving caregiver, though they too failed to detect anything amiss. Some have suggested that Rosemary's apparent ignorance was a survival mechanism. Living with Josef, a man known for his violent temper and authoritarian control, may have conditioned her to avoid questioning his actions out of fear for her own safety. Others, however, argue that her lack of curiosity about the basement and the children's origins raises troubling questions about her role in the family dynamic. Ultimately, Rosemary was never charged with any crimes and was treated by investigators as another victim of Josef's manipulation. She has maintained that she had no knowledge of what was happening in the basement, a claim that many find difficult to reconcile with the sheer scale and duration of Josef's crimes. Rosemary's story remains one of the more ambiguous threads in this dark tale. Was she another victim of Josef's controlling nature, trapped in a cycle of fear and denial? Or was her lack of awareness a willful choice, a way to avoid confronting the unimaginable? These are questions that may never be fully answered, leaving her role in the Fritzl case as one of its most unsettling mysteries. Unfortunately, we will leave it up to you, dear viewer, to form your own opinion on this matter. No matter what you conclude, it's easy in a case like this to lose track of not only time, but the victim's suffering and endurance. We will, however, try to illustrate it here. When Josef Fritzl locked his daughter Elisabeth in the basement, on that fateful day in 1984, the world was a very different place. The Cold War was still ongoing. Ronald Reagan was President of the United States, and the world had yet to experience the Internet revolution. By the time Elisabeth and her children were freed in 2008, 24 long years had passed, an entire generation. During those decades, history marched on. In 1989, just 5 years into Elisabeth's captivity, the Berlin Wall fell, marking the end of the Cold War and symbolizing newfound freedom for millions across Europe, freedom that Elisabeth could only dream of. In 1991, the Gulf War erupted and the Soviet Union dissolved, reshaping the political landscape of the world. That same year, Elisabeth was still trapped in the dark, now caring for 3 children born in captivity. While people around the globe were celebrating a new era of globalization and democracy, Elisabeth's life remained frozen in an unchanging prison beneath her family home. As the 1990s gave way to the new millennium, technological advancements transformed the way people lived. In 1997, the world marveled at the launch of NASA's Pathfinder mission to Mars, and in 1998, Google was founded, paving the way for the digital revolution. Yet, Elisabeth and her children had no access to the outside world. They had never heard of the internet, cell phones, or even witnessed the simplest freedoms of modern life. In 2001, the September 11th attacks on the United States changed the course of history. A new era of global conflict and security concerns began. While millions mourned and nations grappled with the aftermath, Elisabeth was enduring yet another year of confinement, caring for her youngest child, Felix, who had been born the year before. By 2004, Facebook had been launched, and social media was starting to connect billions of people worldwide. But Elisabeth and her children, hidden in their underground world, had never even seen a computer, let alone experienced the rapid evolution of technology that was transforming everyday life. Finally, in 2008, the year Elisabeth was rescued, the world was deep in the throes of a global financial crisis. Barack Obama was making history as the first African American to be elected President of the United States. Meanwhile, in a small Austrian town, Elisabeth was taking her first steps toward freedom, bringing to light a story of unimaginable cruelty that had been unfolding in silence for nearly a quarter of a century. 24 years is a long time, an era filled with monumental world events, cultural shifts, and progress that Elisabeth could only hear about through fragmented glimpses of the outside world provided by Josef. For her and her children, time had stood still. While the world moved forward, they remained trapped, their lives suspended in the darkness beneath the garden. After Josef's conviction, Elisabeth Fritzl and her 6 surviving children were relocated to a secure, undisclosed location. Austrian authorities provided them with new identities to protect them from media intrusion and public scrutiny. Their home has been described as fortress-like, ensuring their safety and shielding them from unwanted attention. The children, now between the ages of 20 and 34, have reportedly continued intensive therapy to cope with their trauma. Elisabeth, described as a resilient and dedicated mother, has worked tirelessly to help her children adjust to life outside captivity. According to Austrian media, the family lives together, supporting each other as they navigate their new lives. Despite the profound challenges they face, Elisabeth and her children have chosen to remain a close-knit family unit, finding strength in one another. Now 88 years old, Josef Fritzl has spent the last 16 years incarcerated for his horrific crimes. Initially held in a psychiatric detention facility, Fritzl's health has steadily declined. Reports indicate that he suffers from dementia and is physically frail, requiring assistance to walk. His lawyer, Astrid Wagner, recently stated that Fritzl no longer poses a danger to the public, claiming that his sex drive is completely gone and that he struggles to distinguish between reality and fiction. In his increasingly delusional state, Fritzl reportedly believes he is participating in a television program called Carousel. His deteriorating mental and physical condition has raised the possibility of his conditional release. Austrian media has suggested that, if granted, Fritzl would be placed in a nursing home rather than being reintegrated into society. A decision on his potential release is expected imminently, sparking debate about whether someone responsible for such atrocities should ever be allowed to leave confinement, regardless of their condition. The Fritzl case remains one of the most infamous crimes in modern history, continuing to inspire documentaries, books, and dramatizations. Over the years, numerous films and series have explored the horror of the events, the resilience of Elisabeth, and the broader questions about how such atrocities could remain hidden for so long. These adaptations have kept the case in the public consciousness, serving as a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance and the fight for justice. For Elisabeth and her children, privacy remains paramount. They have deliberately stayed out of the public eye, focusing on healing and moving forward. Their story is one of unimaginable pain, but also one of survival and resilience. While Josef Fritzl's life fades into fragility and obscurity, Elisabeth and her children live on under their new identities, working to reclaim the time and freedom they were so cruelly denied. Their location may remain a secret, but their journey is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even in the face of the darkest adversity. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the darkest and most harrowing cases in modern history. The story of Josef Fritzl and Elisabeth Fritzl is a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty, but also of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. If you found this episode thought-provoking, we invite you to like, share, and subscribe to the Midnight Docket for more cases that delve into the shadows of humanity. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you next time on the Docket.